Hello and welcome to today's Permaculture Masterclass, where we dive deep into the many rabbit holes that permaculture opens. Just as the permaculture enthusiast eventually takes a PDC, the PDC graduate eventually goes to deeper levels of mastery and proficiency beyond the PDC. Today, we are honored to welcome Ethan Tapper. Ethan is a forester, author, and digital creator from Vermont, whose book, How to Love a Forest: The Bittersweet Work of Tending a Changing World, was published in 2024. With roots in rural Vermont, Ethan's journey took him from the wilderness expeditions and draft horse logging to earning a forestry degree at UVM. At Chittenden County, as a Chittenden County forester, he championed responsible stewardship for thousands of acres and earned national recognition. Today, Ethan runs Bear Island Forestry, where his work restoring a 175-acre forest inspired his book and reflects his mission to heal our relationship with the natural world. Ethan, welcome. We're so pleased to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're really looking forward to this. I was talking to you before we started the conversation. Just the title of your book alone has sparked something inside of me that is just
Mm,
sparks my imagination and sort of stirs some like deep spiritual emotion within me. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Thanks for writing the book. But maybe you could tell us a little bit about like how you got into this forestry sort of like ecology love that you have, and take us as far back as it makes sense. Like, as a kid, did you love nature, or how did you sort of get bit by the nature bug?
sure. Thanks for having me. And yeah, I mean, it's sort of funny. So I've been, the book came out September 10, and since then I've done like 50 events, readings, walks, and talks, and gotten to speak with people like you, getting interviewed and stuff. And so I, like a superhero, I get to have an origin story because people want to know that. It's
Yeah,
pretty cool,
that is
especially
cool.
because in these lives that we live, we just like we go from one thing to the next, and sometimes it can seem like kind of random or haphazard or whatever. And then sometimes it adds up to something, and you're like, oh yeah, that thing that I did that made no sense at the time actually put me exactly where I am right now.
Yeah.
So basically, as best as I can figure it, this is what happened. I grew up in this little town, little village called Saxton's River, which is in Windham County, southeastern Vermont. It's tiny, it's like 300 people, and it's surrounded by wild forests. But I think a lot of times when we hear about these nature writers or like ecologists, biologists, uh, they're always like, I was the nature kid, and they were like, I was in the, down in the dirt looking at bugs, and I was trying to learn the names of all the different wildflowers, and I was catching frogs and tracking deer and all that stuff. And that wasn't the case for me at all.
Ah.
What I do remember growing up in that little town was that I wanted to get out of there bad.
Mm.
And I remember saying to somebody my junior year of high school, I don't know where I'm going to go to college, but I know where I'm not going to go. And that's the University of Vermont because everybody goes there. I'm getting out of here. And then the first month of my senior year of college, I got a letter from the University of Vermont that told me that I got this full scholarship to UVM. And so I was like, guess I'm going to the University of Vermont. And without much more thought than that. And even once I got there, though, I didn't know what I wanted to do. And I was just kind of like bumbling around, taking classes and different things without any kind of real direction. And then what happened is that my high school girlfriend, the first like big love of my life, she was on this program, this 5-month wilderness expedition. And she was coming back as I was finishing up my second semester at UVM. And she had this like huge, just like expansive, massive experience, and I had not. I'd just been like playing beer pong in my dorm room or whatever, and we weren't connecting, and I was afraid that we were going to break up. And so basically, for that reason alone, I was like, well, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going on a wilderness expedition, and the next one left in 2 weeks. And it was 6 months long, 3 months skiing north through the woods of Vermont, New Hampshire, and then building a canoe and canoeing back down.
Cool.
And relationship didn't work out. I did this in retrospect, basically for no reason, and yet it totally changed the course of my life. So I spent the years that followed. I worked as a wilderness guide. As you mentioned, I did a little bit of logging with draft animals. I lived in this like uninsulated yurt with a fir bough floor in the woods of Maine for a year.
Mm.
And I started doing all this cool stuff in the woods. And then I got a letter from the University of Vermont that said that if I didn't come back, I was going to lose my scholarship. And so I remember sitting on the fir bough floor of my yurt and looking at a paper list of all the majors at the University of Vermont. And I scrolled down to forestry and I didn't know what it was, but I knew that it had the word forest in it. And so with basically no more thought than that, I decided to study it. And, just a word about forestry, like forestry is so special. And I know that, there are cases in which forestry is like essentially about resource extraction, and I think that a lot of people see forestry solely that way, that they're like, it's about logging and about money and all this stuff. And that's really not what it is. And it is done that way sometimes, but it also contains multitudes.
Mm.
And what I really see the goal and the purpose of forestry is to manage these incredibly beautiful and dynamic and precious ecosystems, whatever that means. And there's a couple cool things about it. Like, when I was in school, you have all these people that are going on down all these different tracks in the environmental sciences, the natural sciences, and maybe some of them are, they're interested in bugs, right? So they're going to be an entomologist, or they're interested in rocks, so they're going to be a geologist, or they're interested in birds, they want to be an ornithologist. They're interested in plants, they want to be a botanist. And foresters are sort of like responsible for all of that stuff.
Mm.
You know about soil science and hydrology and wildlife biology and dendrology and like all these other things, because you're ultimately responsible for that entire ecosystem. Like you're responsible for no individual part of it. You're responsible for the whole thing.
Mm.
And the thing about studying it is you get so much more of a holistic view of like how these ecosystems work, because you can start to see these incredibly delicate and intricate relationships between all those different pieces and parts that make these ecosystems function, right? And these patterns repeated again and again across these ecosystems is very beautiful. And the
Yeah.
other thing that's very special about foresters is that imbued in us from the very beginning is the idea that we do not have to be bystanders in these ecosystems, that we can go into them and we can appreciate them and see how beautiful they are, and also see, what's going on with them, where they're at more broadly, and then we can go and do something about it.
Mm.
And that sort of attitude really infused this book, How to Love a Forest, and inspired me to write this book, which is ultimately about that. Like, where are we with these ecosystems that are precious to the lives of every living thing on this planet, ourselves included? And what can we do to actually help them to move beyond this place of thinking that the only evolved relationship with forests, the only way that we can love them is just to leave them alone and hope for the best, into a place of like stewardship,
Yeah.
using the power and the tools and the technology and the resources at our disposal to protect these incredibly precious things.
Mm. Beautiful. We talked a little bit before. You don't identify as a permaculturist per se, but you end up
Mhm.
working with a lot of permaculture individuals, and
Yeah.
I see why now, because two of the key themes you just mentioned, which are thinking of the ecosystems or the forest as a whole, is so central to permaculture thinking. One of
Mm.
the principles we use is patterns to details. So it's like, yeah, so it's like we're really thinking about meta patterns, watershed level, bioregional level patterns, and then we're getting down to the minutia of the individual species and the niches contained
Mm.
within. But also that of not being just a passive hands-off conservation model, but being active. And with that comes a lot of responsibility and a lot of, I think maybe this is where the bittersweet part comes in with your
Yeah.
story, because there is a lot of like, shoot, should I interfere with this process right now? Should I steer it in a way that I think is the right way to steer it? And you can even see that with an individual tree. Should I trim this tree? What's that
Mm.
going to do over the next 50 years? It's a lot of responsibility for us. But I
Yeah.
do believe it belies and speaks to this nature, what I believe is our true essential nature as human beings, which is as stewards over the land and with the land, and
Hmm.
in a broad expanse of time, seventh generation thinking. We don't
Yeah.
really think that way in our culture, but it sounds like you're right there with sort of us in the permaculture world, thinking about these long-term stewardship model connections. Maybe you could talk a little bit about your interactions with permaculture and how you think about the challenge of working with this long-term successional pattern that will indeed outlive all of us.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I've got a bunch of good buddies who are in the permaculture world, and I really appreciate it. Like anything else, it's like it's nuanced, and if you were to go to cut down a beautiful area of forest and replace it with a food forest, that would be not okay. But if we're thinking about permaculture as a means to more responsibly produce food, to create these more biodiverse food systems and things like that, I think that's so radical,
Mm,
and so exciting because, there's this ideas that we want these high-tech solutions to all these things, right? And there are these natural processes and ecosystems and species that are low tech and are doing all these things already.
yeah,
And if we can find a way to harness those natural processes to help us live here in a way that's more responsible, it's the most beautiful thing in the world.
yeah,
So yeah, shout out to permaculture. Um, and then of course it's also nuanced, right? Because
yep,
those permacultural systems, in addition to like our conventional agricultural systems, we need to remember are completely dependent on ecosystems. Like still they're relying on these wild things, these systems that are essentially self-regulating, even if that means that we're also helping them do that at
mm,
times. But they're relying on those, for things like soil formation, for things like pollination. One thing that I tell people, everybody thinks about pollinators. Everybody loves pollinators and all these butterflies, and they want to have these beautiful pollinator meadows. And what I try to remind them is that, like a lot of those creatures, the moths and the butterflies and the bees, they might visit your wildflower meadow, but they live in the woods. Like most of
mm,
those things are actually dependent upon things like dead wood on the ground,
mm,
bumblebees, carpenter bees, miner bees. We have, in Vermont, we have 300 species of native bees. Most of them rely on forests in order to be able to complete their entire life cycle. And the similar things like our trees are these massive nurseries for all of these lepidopteran species, like all the moths and the butterflies. So yeah, it's important to have these like cool systems, and then to also recognize that those things that that more managed system, a permacultural situation, even a conventional agricultural situation, must exist like in concert with these ecosystems.
yeah, yeah,
But another interesting thing to think about it is like, you know uh, I mentioned, so these ecosystems, which are sort of like what we say wild, or like self-regulating, but a lot of the work that I do, I'm inserting myself in that system, as you mentioned, right? And I think the key to this is two attributes. So humility, and humility, I have a whole chapter about it in the book. And the idea is that, number one, we recognize that we're dependent on these ecosystems, which we are objectively,
yes,
physically, and they clean our air and clean our water and support our lives in so many different ways, regulate our climate, do all this stuff. Number two, recognizing that we may not even really completely understand them,
yes,
like, and not that we may not, but we do not, right? Number three would be the humility to understand that we also don't intuitively understand them, that like most people's vision of what a healthy forest looks like is
mm,
completely wrong.
mm,
I've walked in the woods with thousands of people, and a lot of times what they imagine to be like the perfect forest is the cathedral, I call it. So it's these
yeah,
evenly spaced big trees, tall arching canopy, open understory. And that's all about us. And that has nothing to do with forest ecology. And actually, almost the opposite of what a really healthy, diverse, functional, intact forest looks like.
mm,
Right. So that also requires humility. Like, we're not even born with an understanding of what healthy forest looks like or what it means to care for them. It's actually something that we need to develop, and it's actually counterintuitive. It
yes,
goes against our instincts. And so that makes it even more radical when we can figure out how to do it and sort of like get past that.
mm,
Having the humility to also understand that we're not going to be right all the time,
right,
and that doesn't mean that we don't do anything, and I think that that's the other term, which is courage. So like, we need to be humble, we need to recognize all of those things, and we also need to be brave enough to act anyway.
mm.
And then, to do our best and, to do this incredibly life-giving work, and to recognize that, not everything goes perfect. And when that happens, we take a deep breath and we adapt and we keep going.
Yeah.
And I think about that not as like us trying to, create forests like in our image or to try to make them into these engineered systems, but really helping them be themselves,
Yeah.
recognizing that they're incredibly altered and that they're dealing with all of these incredible threats and stressors, and that they're heading into a future that promises more of that than ever before.
Yeah.
And so, we can do it in a way that's not just about us, that's also about them. So that sort of goes back to what you started this question with as well.
Beautiful. And I just want to shout out quickly in the chat, Derek, Christine, Becky, Ann, Jim, Greg. Thanks for all being here, guys, and chiming in. And I didn't mention it, but this is, the chat is live, and Ethan can read the questions. So if you have questions as we go, I think we're just interested in having a good conversation. So don't hesitate if you have any thoughts as they pop up. And Ethan, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the bittersweet, because like you said, your book is really a love story. And I think that's the piece that sort of our materialistic worldview puts us in this, like, we're just viewing, there's almost like this false like separation between the nature and the world and like what we're doing and how we're behaving within it. And what it sounds like you're leading us toward is really how to love ecosystems, how to love an individual tree, how to love all the aspects of it, including when you make a mistake, including
Yeah.
that humility that you reference. You took some courage to make a cut or to make a decision in the landscape, and then
Yeah.
only later do you realize, shoot, had I done it this way, it probably would have been better. So there's like this sensitivity, there's like this achingness that comes along with it. And it
Yeah.
seems to be one of the central sort of themes of your book. So talk to us about that bittersweet quality. What do you mean by it? How does it come up?
Yeah.
How do you deal with it?
So I think that, I had this idea with the book, and again, and just walking with all these people in the woods and talking about forests. I think there's a perception that there's this like dichotomy in our society. And we have like over here, we have people who love forests, and for a bunch of different reasons, one of them being that like we haven't done a good job managing forests on this continent over the last few hundred years. Um, they believe that if you love forests, the only way that you can love them, care for them, and feel compassionately toward them is to leave them alone. Right.
Yeah.
And then on the other hand is the perception that there are these people over here who are the people who are like doing stuff in them. And it, people who are doing something as counterintuitive as like cutting a tree. And those must be the people who just don't care. And the interesting thing about my journey is like I went from a place of being over here, and I was like working as a guide, and I was like the loggers, the hunters, the anybody who would change these beautiful ecosystems, they're wrong. They must be. And then once I really entered, studied forest, worked within these forests, and spent time with them, entered into this, really what I've come to understand, deep knowledge, deep relationship with these ecosystems.
Hmm.
And when you get into that place and you actually see where they're at and all the stuff that they're dealing with, suddenly inaction doesn't seem like such a great idea.
Hmm.
And suddenly you realize that, like, here where I am in New England, basically every forest anyone here has ever been in was cleared in the 1800s.
Yep.
Many of them maintained as agricultural land for a century or 150 years. In
Yep.
southern New England, some of them even longer. And then the forests that we have now are like often super young, super simple, 60 to 100 years removed from that management, haven't had time to develop any of the qualities of the old growth forests that were 90 to 95% of our landscape for thousands of years. The
Mm-hmm.
qualities that all of our native biodiversity is adapted to.
Yep.
And at the same time that all that's happening, they've lost multiple animal species, lost tree species, functionally lost others to non-native invasive pathogens. They've had non-native plants introduced that outcompete all of our native species and completely disrupt our natural processes. They're dealing with the changing climate, deer overpopulation, pollution, forest fragmentation, deforestation, all of this stuff at once. And so it starts to feel less like to keep our hands off in every case as this extraordinary act of compassion, and more like it might be an act of negligence.
Mm.
And one thing I say in the book that I think is so true is that I believe this. I believe that we can degrade forests by exploiting them, as in many cases we have for the last several hundred years, and we can degrade them by doing nothing.
Yeah.
And we don't get to, we have these resources, we have these powers. We don't get off the hook just because we're like, I don't want to be involved with this personally. Like, we have these ecosystems that are the way they are. Here we are. And we stand on the legacies that we stand on, and we have the power that we have. And just because it makes us uncomfortable doesn't mean that we don't have to do it. Right. And so, but I believe that, a lot of these things that we got to do, and, in practice, there's things like cutting trees, killing deer, right? If you're approaching those things and you love those trees and you love those deer so much that it breaks your heart and you do it anyway, that's love. That's real compassion. And that's where I came from. I mean, I've killed now dozens of deer. I cry every time. And for me, I'm like, I never want this to not be the case, because that shows me, that I'm actually, approaching these situations with gravity that they deserve.
Yeah.
I don't want to go out there and just be, cutting trees down and not feeling anything about it. I want to be like, this is a big deal, and it is. And I'm going to do it anyway, because this is what is necessary in this moment to protect ourselves, to protect future generations, to protect every living thing on this planet.
Yeah. Beautiful. There's some good questions that I want to get to, but just one off of that real quick is, how, to a lot of us, including here in Michigan, we are on forested land. That's where a lot of people just naturally find themselves. It's not like our permaculture is like starting from a grass landscape or something and we want to build a food forest. It's often we're already in an existing forest, but it's like you say, poorly managed. It had been previously clear cut in the past 150 years or so, and there's a lot of debris, etc. Just on the subject of cutting a tree, how do you as a forester think about like when to cut trees, which trees to select? I'm thinking of a permaculturist who's on the landscape looking around in their forest.
Yeah.
What might you say to guide them to start to shift the ecology a little bit in a better way?
I mean, it's incredibly nuanced. And what I would say is, if this is not something you're familiar with, I would really recommend reaching out. Almost every state has service foresters. These are just foresters that work for the public. And that's what I did for 8 years until this year. And they, have not just like the understanding of forest ecology, but then also like the nuanced understanding of your unique forests that can tell you a little bit more information about it. And it's usually free. So those come take a walk with you and be like, this is what's going on. Yeah. And there are other conservation organizations as well that have resources that can help you. I mean, it's difficult to say categorically, because all these ecosystems are so different. And one thing that I talk about a lot, I have this social media channels. And one big thing that we can do here in Vermont that serves so many important purposes is like putting dead wood on the ground. Right. And then you post these videos and then everybody from the American West is like, fire hazard. You're like, well, yeah, it's different here, than it is over there. And you can't, there's nothing I could tell you that would be true to absolutely everywhere you go. So it depends. And even when like Vermont's little, I go to different parts of this state and it's different.
Yeah.
Right. But I mean, in general, a couple techniques that you could adapt to almost anywhere that you are is there's a technique that I really like called crop tree release. And the idea is that, the sort of more old school way of managing your forest, especially if you're doing it yourself, you just go in there and you see all the trees that seem like they have something wrong with them, that they're unhealthy or whatever. And you just, hammer away at those, cut them down. And not only is that not very efficient, because usually you're just never going to get anywhere, but it's also not the most pragmatic way to approach making your forest healthier. So what I try to do is flip that on its head, and instead of thinking about what needs to go, we think about what needs to grow or what we want to grow.
Yeah.
Those are our crop trees, even if they're not producing like a crop
Mm.
in a traditional sense, like maple sap for
Okay.
maple syrup here in Vermont. So just think about that. A crop tree is just a tree that's a really healthy tree. That's beautiful. It has a nice symmetrical crown, no wounds or defects. Maybe it's of a species that produces mast, some food for wildlife, or just a species that seems like it's doing really well on your site. And you look up at that tree and you cut the trees that are competing with your crop tree,
Yeah.
whose crowns are, we call it a crown touching release, whose crowns are touching the crown of your crop tree. And if they're not doing that, you have to be strict with yourself and you have to leave them alone. And what that does is a bunch of different things. So that is going to maximally, make you maximally efficient. I don't even know if maximally is a word. Make you
It
as
is now.
efficient. Yeah, there you go. Make you as efficient as possible, because every tree that you're cutting is releasing one of the healthiest trees in your forest,
Mm.
right? And so it allows you to get way more done because you're just focusing on this progressive work that you want to do,
Mm.
right? And the other thing that it does, which is interesting, is that it allows us to also have some unhealthy trees in the forest,
Mm.
which is also really important to forest ecology. Like if we cut every tree that has a defect or a wound or internal rot, we're actually going to be losing a lot of these really important habitats and ecological attributes that sustain the forest in another way,
Mm.
right? So an example that I think about is um, a species I write about a little bit in the book. I consider it to be a keystone species in our ecosystems called the pileated woodpecker, right? I believe it's our largest woodpecker in the continent, and it is in here in Vermont. And pileated woodpeckers, they do all these seemingly contradictory things, right? So they put holes in trees, which is like, if you were just up there and you saw a tree that you liked, and a woodpecker put a hole in it, you'd be like, ah, crap. You know, I hate that bird.
Yeah. Stupid
But
bird.
really what that bird's doing is that the fact that the woodpeckers there are putting a hole in that tree is almost certainly a symptom of something else that's going on. It
Yes.
wouldn't be foraging in that tree if that tree wasn't already stressed and harboring populations of bark boring beetles and things like that, which is what it's hunting for.
Yep.
Woodpeckers also create, as they're doing that, create cavities, right? Holes in trees, which are important nesting and denning habitat for dozens of different species. And they do another thing, or they do a couple other things. They also help do what we call nutrient cycling. So they're helping break down those trees, dead trees and trees that are dying, and help them, more quickly incorporate into the soil, along with this whole community of organisms that I call the necrosphere. Things like bacteria and fungi, invertebrates that are all part of this entire group of organisms that, dead and dying trees is their habitat, and what they perform for the forest as a whole is basically helping create soil. But the other thing they do is pileated woodpeckers regulate populations of forest pests. So yeah, they're out there, pecking away at your trees and putting holes in the trees and stuff like that. But at the same time, they're also actually protecting the trees in your forest by
Yep.
regulating the populations of those insects that, if they weren't regulated, would build up, populations that would lead them to become a pest and actually to be potentially like a forest health threat.
Yep.
So if we didn't have trees that had issues, which are also normal, you might not have habitat for the pileated woodpecker, and we might actually lose this really important natural way that our forest helps regulate populations of these potential pests.
Beautiful. Yeah, perfectly well said. A really great and sort of perennial question in the permaculture world relates to invasive species. Christine
Mm,
asked a question about just your general thoughts, and obviously it depends is always the answer.
yeah.
And invasive to when is a really sort of great permaculture question. We try to answer, apple is an invasive species if you want to characterize like that. My co-teacher in permaculture, Milton Dixon, always says humans are invasive species. It's like
Sure.
we're the most invasive. All that aside, it's a
Yeah.
nuanced question. We obviously want to favor and support native ecosystems,
Yeah.
and often invasive species live in the edge region, like right at the edge of the forest and the farm or whatnot. But what is your approach to it? Because we certainly, in our our work, we really don't like just like pouring a bunch of chemicals on them to get rid of them. Yet at the same time, it's a lot of work to get in there with a chainsaw and get rid of them as well. So how do you
Yeah.
tend to think about
Boy, this is a tough one.
it?
There is something about non-native invasive species that like breaks people's brains. Uh, and what I mean by this is that, and this it might be hard to hear. It is an inconvenient truth, right? And it's a bummer. These plants are really hard to deal with, uh, and they must be dealt with. Period. Like this is one of the most radical acts of things that we can do as an act of compassion for our ecosystems is to remove these non-native plants. Truly. And but for some reason it is so hard, the non-native invasive plants themselves and the measures necessary to control them are so complex and so hard to get our heads around that people will invent these elaborate philosophies about why we shouldn't have to do it. So the fact that some non-native invasive plants have medicinal properties does not give us license to let them degrade and destroy our ecosystems.
Hmm.
You know, they are and they are not gonna our ecosystems are not going to adapt to these plants. And on any time frame that is meaningful to us, I mean, maybe in thousands of years, they would, that will have happened, and in the process, we will have lost thousands or hundreds of thousands of species, which is not a reality that I'm prepared to accept. Another argument that I've heard is someone said, well, aren't they, climate adapted?
Hmm.
Aren't they more climate resilient than our native species? And I said, so is a parking lot. And what I mean by that is that we we aren't, just because a parking lot is more resilient to, these extreme climatic changes does not mean we're going to cut down all of our ecosystems and pave them. And why don't we do that? We don't do that because they're precious, and because they're beautiful, and because they have the right to exist, and because they support our lives and our quality of life in so many ways. And uh, it just is a bummer that we have to deal with these non-native invasive plants. I will say that once you start looking at some of these tree pathogens and pests, these non-native invasive plants start to seem really easy to control, because there's really basically nothing that we can do about these non-native pests and pathogens, or it's a lot more difficult to deal with something like the emerald ash borer,
Yeah.
right? And uh, yeah, so it's a tricky thing. And so what I would say is that also sometimes people have reactions to like the way that people talk about non-native invasive plants, like that it in some way is conflated with how we talk about people,
Yes. Yes.
non-native
Yes.
non-native people,
Yep.
which I totally get, and I'm open to reforming that language. And also, that is not a reason not to control non-native invasive plants, because we have a problem with the language. Um, and some other people have problems with just like the energy that we approach this struggle with.
Hmm.
And I think it's important that we know that there is no debate in our scientific community that these non-native invasive plants are a profound biodiversity threat, and absolutely need to be dealt with. There's no debate. And the research and the points of view to the contrary are of similar rigor to things like climate change denial. They're just like, you could find someone who will tell you that, or you could listen to thousands of scientists who will tell you the inconvenient truth that is otherwise.
Hmm.
So yeah, so I think about it less like, going back to that, like that this isn't some the language is harmful or whatever. I think that allowing these non-native invasive plants to attack our ecosystems could be seen to be like a colonialist mentality,
Yes.
right? Imagine these ecosystems. They are these ancient and precious and diverse and beautiful communities, and they have the right to exist. And they have these delicate relationships, and they're dynamic, and they're complex, and and then there are these other plants that move in, right? and they displace those native species, and they displace their natural processes, and they prevent those ecosystems, those communities, from being able to live and being able to be how they are. And is that something that we want to let happen? Or is it our job as stewards of these ecosystems, of this biosphere, to protect those incredibly precious and vulnerable communities? Um, I think it's really, really important that we get over these philosophical arguments against controlling non-native invasive plants, and embrace the reality that, like, this is one of the most important things that we can possibly do for these ecosystems that have a lot of these plants, is to get rid of them.
And doesn't it too sort of highlight exactly the premise of your book and so much of permaculture, which is really we need humans tending to landscapes in mass, like we have historically done with our indigenous populations, and doing it on in a scientific basis with respect to indigenous land management practices, or else because we already are the number one, land moving factor on Earth and ecosystem
Mm,
changing factor on Earth, that really, yeah, if we're trying to do the invasive species sort of takedown thing, it's either chemicals, it seems, or
yeah.
people get out there and manage it in their own landscapes by slowly but surely. This is what we do in our landscape here, and I bet you do similar things. Often we'll use, say, like autumn olive or something like that, which is an invasive species here. And we'll actually plant trees that are native, oak, say, or something like that, right in the middle of a thicket. We might clear out a little area, plant it in there, let that oak be protected by the autumn olive for some period of time until the oak is now above the autumn olive, cut all the olive autumn underneath it, let it to decompose and rot. And eventually, now, of course, this takes time, the oak will shade out the autumn olive and it will no longer thrive there. And I'm sure you have many other examples of what you might do, including maybe like prescribed and controlled burns. So that might be an approach, is like actually becoming stewards within our landscape. And it may take 20, 30, 40 years to eradicate these um,
Yeah. I mean,
invasives.
I don't want to lose anybody that's on this podcast right now. I will say that that I use herbicide on non-native invasive plants.
Yeah,
And the reason for that is because I have seen it attempted hundreds of times without using it. It doesn't work. And so on my land, for instance, I had 30 acres of pure Japanese barberry, waist high, no native plants. Wouldn't have been physically possible.
exactly.
Um,
Yeah.
and that is, of all the things that I've done, that was the hardest thing to wrap my head around. And now I view that to actually be one of the most radical things that I've done, because it was so hard to do and it was absolutely necessary. And now I have spring ephemeral wildflowers and this abundant and diverse and beautiful understory that's growing there in this forest where, if I hadn't done that, it was done.
Yeah.
It had no future. And so I'm really proud to do that. And I think that there are ways to use that. And I know that there are, even people who are not, who are like are in organic agriculture, or organic minded people who practice agriculture, who have seen that, yeah, there's some things like that are, it's like, we're like, oh no, herbicide, it doesn't have any place in our world. Well, there might be examples where even something like that, even something as, you know chilling to many of us
Yes.
as that is, could be used as a tool for good.
Yes.
And it's why I know it's wild to think about, and I want to acknowledge for many of you watching this, listening to this, how dissonant that must feel, and allow me to tell you that no one felt more that way than I did.
Mm.
And now, um, I've sort of like embraced the nuance of that, and recognize that actually, like, used in the right way, the right herbicide used in the right way in this one specific circumstance, uh, can actually be a force of healing, as crazy as that sounds.
Thank you for adding that nuance. And I think this is an adult way to approach it, which is not just like thinking of something as being the baddie, but like everything in areas of gray. And in fact, Ethan, you're not alone. David Holmgren, co-founder of permaculture, has said as much. He's like, there are times when herbicides, if you're resetting an ecosystem into a native ecosystem that you will never spray with herbicide again, how is that not a net positive? So thank you
Mm.
for adding that. And just to transition a little bit out of this conversation, I have written in my notes just the word wolf trees. It just
Yeah.
strikes something within me. And I wonder if you can
Yeah.
tell us what that is and what that might mean.
So wolf tree is there's a number of different potential origins of this term, and I had always heard that a wolf tree was a tree that once was standing in the middle of an open field like a lone wolf.
Mm.
I've also heard since in recent years that maybe it was um, because they were seen to be like spreading disease and they were inefficient and they people didn't like the way that they were growing because they're kind of gnarly and so they would conflate with them like the negative connotations that people would have with wolves 100 years ago or 200 years ago or whatever.
Mm.
But what they basically are in our modern forests is they're these trees that are just so much older than all the trees around us in these young forests. So a lot of times they'll have this open branching pattern, reaching these branches out into lateral space all around these massive globe crowns. The reason they have that form is because when they were growing, there was no other trees competing with them. When two trees grow together, they tend to reach up toward the light, but when there's no trees beside them, they reach out in every direction.
Mm.
And they're just these really cool old trees. And there was a time when people called those they used a nasty word to describe trees like that. They called them decadent, right?
Oh.
And they were called decadent because they were taking up a lot of space that in theory could be used to grow younger, faster growing, more valuable, thrifty trees. And and they were killed or cut just kind of to get them out of the way.
Mm.
And now what we understand, especially in our really young modern forests, is that these old trees are providing tremendous value. Maybe not financial value, like as timber or whatever, but tremendous ecological value. And they are, doing all of these really amazing things, providing habitat for so many different species of living things, and are just this really cool structure to have around. And I actually wrote one thing that I think about. I used to take these walks with landowners, and you're in this young forest, and then you encounter a wolf tree.
Mm.
And I don't like to anthropomorphize trees too much, but it's just a good point to say, like, imagine what this tree, if this tree were a person, what it would have seen,
Mm.
right? It would have seen, it could have been at one time a sapling growing in an old growth forest,
Yeah.
right? And then all the trees around it were cut, and suddenly it was in the middle of a giant pasture on a landscape that was like an ocean of pastures. And then for 100 or 150 years, it had, livestock, probably sheep and then cows grazing around it, sleeping, under its shade. And then over the last 60 to 100 years, it had this forest regenerate in those fields as they went fallow and regrow around it. And it was just so in one of the chapters, which is about legacy, this idea of legacy, I sort of follow a wolf tree on that journey.
Mm.
And, as a means to describe these profound landscape changes that really define our forest today.
Yeah, that's beautiful. The word legacy came to my mind as you were talking about it. I've often identified trees as legacy trees. I don't know, it just popped into my brain, I guess, or maybe it came from a book or something, but that's a nice way to start to understand a forest that you're tending to. There's these natural like subdivisions of the land that speak to you in certain ways. Oh, this is a very shady area. This is where the spring ephemeral
Mm,
is. This is where these certain species really thrive. This is the wolf tree. These are legacy areas, that sort of thing. And this ties really well into, I think, maybe you could tell us about your work with Bear Island, which is essentially, if I have it right, you're sort of tending to 175 acres. That's something again that us permaculturists find ourselves in
mm,
situations like this. As soon as I hear
mm,
that, I think, man, I'd love to have a group of people helping me tend that. So it's not
yeah.
just me. So tell us about a little bit about how you acquired the land. And I know the land I think
Mm.
is in trust now, but how do you manage something so big as a forester?
Yeah, I mean I had managed. I was a consulting forester working for private landowners, and then a service forester working for the state to help private landowners. Um, and so I had like managed other people's land.
Mm.
But I always had this dream that I was going to have sort of a forest of my own and maybe a little homestead or something. And my buddy was like, "Hey, did you see that, that listing for that big piece of land online?" And I was like, "No, I didn't see that." And looked it up, and there's 175 acres, and there was just a picture of this famous mountain in Vermont called Camel Summit.
Mm.
Nothing else, nothing about the forest. There's just 175 acres. Here's a picture of Camel Summit. And as if to say, buy this land and you can, build your mansion and look at Camel Summit or whatever. So I was like, all right, well, I'll go check it out. It's pretty cheap. So I was like, gosh, what's wrong with it? This is in an area where land is pretty expensive, and it was relatively cheap. And so I went there, and my first impression was that I started driving up the access road, and it hadn't been properly stabilized, and there was a ravine cutting right down the center, and I was like straddling it with the wheels of the truck. And then I rolled up onto this log landing, this clearing where that picture had been taken from, and it was covered in trash. Bags of household trash, busted pieces of equipment like partially buried in the ground, hydraulic hoses and cables and buckets. It was nasty.
That's what's wrong with
it. Yeah. And that was the beginning, right? Like
Yeah.
I'd been on there all of 10 seconds. And then I, going out from that landing in every direction, these logging trails, skid trails, with these 3-foot deep ruts that were just going off in every direction. And just like, bleeding murky water down the mountain. And it was not a very good way to start, but I was like, you know what, I'm here, I'll go take a walk. And so I started to walk up the main skid trail, and it was really crazy steep. And I was picking ticks off myself. And I had this weird feeling, and I couldn't put my finger on it. Something was wrong. And I was walking for like an hour. And when I realized what it was, which was that there were no healthy trees.
Wow.
Every single tree that I saw was declining, dying, diseased. It was just this weird, like dystopian forest. So what I now know happened was that 30 years before, the previous owners, this timber company, without the supervision of a forest or anything like that, had just told these loggers, go cut every tree bigger than 10 inches in diameter on the mountain, which is like, that big around. Very small. And so they cut every tree bigger than that. And so that's a practice that we call diameter limit cutting. It's this unethical practice. It's really not forest management. It's probably closer to mining because it's solely extractive. And nested within the series of unethical practices that we call high grading. High grading is where you go into the forest and you cut all of the most valuable high grade trees and you leave all of the least valuable low grade trees standing.
Yeah.
And the problem with that is that those high grade trees are also the healthiest trees in the forest almost all the time. And those low grade trees are the least healthy trees in the forest. So you're basically, as efficiently as you can, managing the forest to be less healthy. And there is an argument to be made that those loggers would have done, it would have been a greater kindness to this forest if they had just cut all the trees. Because then at least there could have been a new generation of trees that regenerated and would have had a chance to be healthy. As it was, they just picked out all the healthiest ones. Those unhealthy trees closed their canopies, and then there we were. And I equate it to being like if you, in the middle of summer, if you went into your vegetable garden and you weeded out all the vegetables. That's what this forest was like. Just like totally the opposite of any reasonable or responsible stewardship that we would ever do. And so then I was like walking, just being like, oh my God, no healthy trees, no healthy trees. And also noticing that even where there was enough light that the forest was trying to regenerate, all those young trees were getting browsed by deer. There's also evidence of a deer overpopulation. I slid down over these cliffs that bisect the land from west to east and right down into that 30-acre infestation of Japanese barberry, which is like,
just
for me as
worse.
Yeah. For me as a forester, I'm like, well, this forest is done.
Yeah.
There's nowhere it can go from here. The trees will die and things will change and it will always be barberry. And, and that's the experience. That's what the research says. That's the experience that I've seen time and time again is that they
And
don't
then
go
you're like, hey, where's my realtor? I want to buy this place.
away. Well, so I at that first visit, I was like, I'm out of here,
Yeah.
but then I just started to think about it, and I started
Mm,
to look at it, driving by on the highway, I'd be like looking at it, and then I went back, and when I went back, I started to find all this cool stuff. So I started to find that there were actually some healthy trees there after all, just so hidden behind these masses of unhealthy trees. I hadn't seen them. Uh, some of these plants that I love, like sweet fern and pink corydalis and red columbine and lowbush blueberries, maple leaf viburnum,
mm,
serviceberry. I started to find that there were these rock outcrops covered in reindeer moss with these sweeping views of the Winooski River Valley. And I was
mm.
standing on one of those when I was like, yeah, I'm going to buy this place. And it was funny because I was like, I'd never bought anything like that before, of course. It's like 26 years old. And I called up my old boss who sold forest land real estate. And I was like, Mike, there's this piece of land and I want to make an offer. How much should I offer? And he was like, well, let me ask you some questions about it. Does it have any timber on it? And I said, no. And he was like, any real estate potential? And I was like, no. And he said, is the access good? No.
No.
Could it ever be a sugar bush? No. And eventually he was just like, well, Ethan, this place sounds terrible. Just offer them basically nothing.
Yeah.
And don't be afraid of hurting their feelings. And so that's what I did. And that's how I ended up becoming the owner of this piece of land.
Greg asked, how long have you owned it?
7 years.
7 years, yeah. Well, but again, I resonate, and I bet our listeners do as permaculturists. It's often like the most degraded landscapes that you could possibly find, urban or rural. We maybe uniquely, but with the humility that it takes, see potential there. We see like,
Yeah.
oh, actually, this land really needs Ethan on it because who else is going to come here and like be able to help regenerate this and
Yeah.
actually be able to see what it's capable of and then
Well,
steer it in that
and it's
direction.
also and it's also like if we're normal people, like what we can afford,
Exactly.
you know?
Exactly.
And it's just
So,
like it's such a good example of like where we're at in general.
yes,
Um, because it's just like here we are. We
here we
don't
are.
get to choose. We don't get to choose all of these things. We just like we just are where we are, and we just have to move forward.
Yep.
And if I had, been able to just like magically, or if I had a whole lot of money and I'd been able to just pick any piece of land anywhere, it wouldn't have been anything like this.
Right.
But like this is the land. This is where I live, and this is what it is, and I'm just going to move forward from this place.
That's
And I
right.
think that that's fundamentally the journey that we all need to go on as we try to just heal this world.
Yes. And Jim asked here, 7 years, how's it going? Right. And I asked that question too. How's the process going?
Yeah.
And are you working with a group or how do you, because that's so much acreage. It's like, it would be
Mm.
so wonderful to have extra help, I'm sure. And it's always
Oh
more fun to
yeah.
work with people. So tell us a
Mm.
little bit about your stewardship journey in these 7 years.
Yeah, and I should preface this by saying that I have realized recently that I'm not a normal person. Uh, I, normal people want to like, uh, they don't want to spend all of their free time and all of their money and all of their energy killing themselves trying to work in the woods, and I do.
Okay.
And I
Bless your heart.
also, yeah, and I have a couple superpowers that help me in this struggle. One is ADHD,
Yes.
and that allows me to get into this like hyper focused state, which is not really good for me.
Mm.
Where I just like put my head down, and then 8 hours later, I'm just like, whoa, and what happened? And what happened was I did a lot of work, and I didn't drink any water, I didn't eat any food, I didn't take any breaks, but I
Yeah.
accomplished a crazy amount of stuff.
Yes.
And my other superpower is that I am not a purist.
Mm.
And so I'm willing to make these tough decisions. One of the parallels that I really like to draw is that, like, 30 years ago, these loggers came to my land, and they brought these skidders, the piece of logging equipment, we call them skidders, cable skidders, and made by this company Timberjack. And I know this because I've dug pieces of them out of the ground.
Mm.
And Timberjack cable skidders made between like the late 1970s, early 1980s, and chainsaws, to degrade this forest and create all these problems I'm going to spend the rest of my life fixing. And as I try to heal this forest, two of my most powerful tools are my 1981 Timberjack cable skidder and my chainsaw. And so basically what I've been doing is, I taught myself to run excavator. I run an excavator for a week every year, and I restore those old degraded skid trails and build new, more resilient trails. I take that skidder and I find every single one of those healthy trees that are still here, especially red oak, and release them from competition individually in places where there are literally no healthy trees. I will cut all the trees, and allow a new generation of trees to regenerate that has a chance to be healthy. And, I taught myself to be a hunter, which was probably honestly the hardest skill that I've had to teach myself of all of these things. It's so hard, even where there's a lot of deer. And, and every year try to take as many doe as I can. And, all of these things really have had an incredible impact. And, and by the way, and all that barberry is gone.
Yeah.
So like, it's so funny because now when I go walk with people, colleagues, friends in my forest, we're walking on these beautiful, well-maintained skid trails, and all they're seeing are these beautiful, healthy trees with plenty of room to grow. This forest, which is complex and multi-generational, which has gaps in the canopy and dead wood on the ground. And they're like, oh, this is such a nice, beautiful, healthy forest. And I say, I swear to you, if we had walked here 7 years ago, you would have said, this is the most messed up forest I've ever seen in my life. And it's not been that long of a time, and it has been transformed. Yes. But it's been not through me just like being out there like Johnny Appleseed and just, like doing all the easy stuff, planting trees and stuff that's so easy to do. It's been like I've cut thousands of trees, and killed deer and done this, crazy thing with the barberry, with the herbicide. And now when I walk through there, when I first was standing on that log landing and, suddenly this was my problem, right? When I owned it for the first time and I visited there, I thought that I was like, this land is perfect. It's a perfect symbol for this moment in time. It's a forest with every problem that a forest could have. And just like, the forest of the Anthropocene,
Perfect. Yep.
Yeah. It's just like effed up. And now I see it as a symbol of hope and a symbol of what's possible, because I know what's possible if we're willing to make these tough decisions.
Yeah.
And if we're willing to use these incredibly counterintuitive tools, healing is possible. And the interesting thing too is that it occurs to me that it's not just about mitigation, like stopping the bleeding, trying to just make it so that things don't get any worse than they are right now. Right? What I've seen is actually this land become so much more. And I'm a birder, and I've seen, dozens of species of birds that weren't here before return.
Yep.
And I've seen this forest just become so much more diverse and complex and resilient and hopeful, and just become so much more abundant and full of life. And so it wasn't just like I kept this ecosystem from collapsing. It's like it was generative and regenerative. And I'm so excited to see like where it's going to go from here. If this is possible to do something like this in 7 years, and the process is ongoing, but if it's possible to do something like this in 7 years, I'm like, what's it going to be like when I'm 60 or 70? It's exciting. Yeah. And I believe that if we're willing to make these decisions, we can scale this. Like we can do this across our landscape and not just prevent all of these bad things from happening, but help so many good things happen, help build a better world.
Yeah. Well, you're preaching to the choir, my friend, because that's exactly what we believe and vibe on in permaculture, is a positivistic attitude, especially in the face of such destruction and humans doing bad things to nature. When I was growing up, I thought that's pretty much all humans did to nature. And then you eventually realize, oh no, there's this whole history of humans being really good stewards of natural landscapes. And then permaculture.
Oh, yeah.
permaculture really for me was the door into, oh, you can actually take the most degraded landscape, or you can grow a food
Yeah,
forest in a desert, like these types of things, which gives you, just like you say, the sense of hope and purpose and like excitement about the future rather than just like
yeah.
terror. So thank you. This is a beautiful story. People are vibing on it in the chat saying like, that's amazing work in 7 years. So this is beautiful. um there was a question earlier from Jim, and I'll paraphrase it here. It was something about, um, do you have thoughts about how to bring forests into cities a little bit more? Has that ever been part of your work, like bringing in the natural world into these highly urban, maybe highly concrete jungle areas, or is that not something you've had time to much?
No, I haven't. I'm
Okay,
very interested in it.
yeah,
Um, because I think we would all benefit from having that. Not just because I am very interested in like how we bring the wisdom and the beauty of these ecosystems, to people who live in this completely different environment, and make it relevant to them because they're also ultimately because they're a part of the same world, right?
yep,
And there's a lot more of them than there are who live out here in rural Vermont, and it's important that we all value ecosystems. So, like for that reason, I think I'm very interested in it. I've heard about these. What are they called? There's a Japanese name for these mini forests.
oh, the
Um,
Miyawaki
the
forest.
Miyawaki's, yeah. I'm interested in it. I just don't know anything about it really.
Yeah, I love those forests. I really want to put one in somewhere myself.
Mm.
Let me share your website real quick so people can actually see the website. Please all head on over to EthanTapper.com. You can buy his book there. I'm sure you can get it on Amazon and whatnot. Mine is in shipping, so I haven't read it yet, Ethan, but I'm really excited to read it. Are there, just reflecting on our conversation here, are there key pieces to this story that you tell in the book that we haven't touched on yet that maybe would be good to share with our audience?
Mm. Yeah. It's a good question. I just really think that to give you a sense of like sort of where the whole book is coming from
Yeah.
is that I really just wanted to show how some of these tough things that we do are just like real acts of love, and so not the whole book is about like this really hard to understand stuff. Some of it is just about forests, and reimagining forests. That's a whole nother part of like of the thing is like we can't take care of the thing until we actually understand what the thing looks like.
Mm,
But then also helping people understand, sort of my journey and how deeply I care about forests, so that then when I show you these counterintuitive things that I'm doing, like managing forests, cutting trees, killing deer, uh, that you see, or at least can accept the possibility that these are actually expressions of that love, of that compassion. And that's how we show these ecosystems that we love them. And that's how we help them be themselves.
mm.
And that's how we help them, heal from the wounds of the past, and reverse this trend of degradation that has defined many of our relationships with forests for centuries.
Yeah.
And so it's sort of an expression, a microcosm of this thing that I figured out when I do these forest management projects, working with loggers on these town-owned lands when I was a service forester, and uh, I it was really important to me. To the first thing that we did was like build trust. I need to let them know who I am, and I need to show them how I love these ecosystems intrinsically. I believe that they have the right to exist. I've dedicated my life to just wanting to help them, be themselves,
Yep.
and be beautiful and abundant for their own sake, right? And then, once we build that trust, to then ask them to come with me as they go and see this work that we're doing that is changing them. And it's important to me that we can break through these initial feelings of discomfort, and all of these things that are so reasonable, these reasonable feelings that if you see a beautiful tree getting cut down, that must be incredibly, it is for me as well, incredibly uncomfortable and jarring and counterintuitive. And then we need to move past it, or we need to hold on to that feeling, and have the courage and the humility to act anyway, and
Mm,
to take these uncomfortable actions. So I think that is like really at the core of this work.
yeah.
and something that, I modeled in my own communication, and then tried to model in the book. And just know that if you hear some of the stuff I'm talking about, and you're like, I don't like that. I know. I get it. And I felt the same way, and then have just come to a place where I've realized that actually, these actions are in the most profound acts of stewardship that we can offer in
Mm.
this moment, and are really brave, because moving from a place of love to doing these things that challenge us is radical and uncomfortable, and it's just what we got to do.
Love that. Hey, I just had a thought pop up. And again, we talked about this a little bit before this conversation. I work in a lot of like small community setting, like right here nested in my town, right? Like I want to work with people locally and help each other learn practices. And what did you learn working in your forest? Oh, cool. I'll try that in my forest. These types
Mm.
of collaborative education settings. Have you embarked at all upon like turning this book and this work that you're doing into sort of an education sort of a platform, or bringing people onto your land to discuss how they might then mimic things that you've done on their forest and these types of things? How's that gone for you, if at all?
Yeah, I haven't done it as much, I want it to be part of what I do,
Okay,
to to bring people here. I just need to, this piece of land is it's a work in progress,
totally.
and so I need to be able to invest in some infrastructure to be able to do that, just so like people can have a place to go to the bathroom and stuff.
Totally, totally. But that might be a thing
Yeah,
in the future then, like
but
how to live a
yeah,
forest working groups or something like that. That's what
yeah,
I'm thinking of.
I would love that. Yeah, I would love that.
Yes.
And
And another thought too that popped up is how have you noticed the forestry industry or sort of like these types of like to me it feels like you're bringing this really nuanced like ecosystemic level thinking that I wouldn't necessarily subscribe or ascribe to sort of like maybe just like large scale land management sort of like writ large just standard
mm,
practice. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but are you noticing like larger land management or forestry practices being influenced to maybe do more of this nuance?
mm,
Has it always been that way? And maybe I'm just mis
yeah, it depends. Yeah, so it depends on where they are. Like in Vermont and New Hampshire, this is already the way that it's done. And interestingly, there's actually, some forest management projects on public land that are absolutely in keeping with this nuance and trying to just like manage for biodiversity and ecological integrity and climate resilience and all these things.
mm,
And then some groups that are, especially one group that is like so uncomfortable with the idea of just like cutting trees, that they conflate this work with that larger, like
logging.
120-acre clear cut in Oregon or whatever.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? Which they're different. I say that they're as different from each other as local organic agriculture is from industrial agriculture.
Mm,
Right? And if we were like, went out to, I don't know where, Iowa or something, and we saw industrial agriculture, 1,000-acre field of Roundup Ready wheat or something, and we didn't like it, uh, we would never be like, we need to abolish agriculture. Right? We would be like, oh, I wonder if we can do this in a better way. And how do we do this in a way that more closely aligns with our values, and that protects things like ecology, right? And that is just a better way to do this thing that we got to do.
yes.
And so uh, I think that it's really important to understand that, and also, like, I feel like a lot of that resistance at times, like what we faced on public land here, for these projects that are actually like great projects. They're the best. They're like really good people being really thoughtful about how they want to do this work, and
Mm,
approaching it so carefully and caringly. Um, a lot of the opposition to it is I believe what we call confirmation bias, right? Where it's just like it makes us uncomfortable, and so we, instead of like sitting in that and sitting with that and asking questions about it and being like, maybe this is nuanced. We instead look for all of these reasons why it should be wrong.
Mm.
Like we look for those, whatever will affirm the feeling that we already have.
Yes.
And so I think that those organizations sometimes, they're sitting in this place of just discomfort, and instead of like dealing with that, they're creating all of these realities that just aren't true. And so that's
Mm.
something that fundamentally we as stewards of this world need to not do. And we need to understand that, like, so many of these things are so incredibly nuanced.
Yes.
So yeah, so I a lot of the work here in the Northeast is already being done that way. Some of it is not, but I am really interested in seeing. The book's only been out for 2 months, but seeing the way that it changes. Not just how larger pieces of land are managed, hopefully, and then also the public perception, because this book is ultimately written just for people. The public perception of the good management that's already happening, and
Mm.
hopefully, at least, I don't need everybody to be like, forest management's great, because it's not. Like, I don't think it's good or bad. I know it can be done in ways that can degrade ecosystems and that are exploitative,
For sure.
and it can be done in ways that are like essential, life-giving, vital,
Yes.
critical. And so we don't need to just be like, every time we see a tree getting cut down, it's a good thing. All we need to do is understand that it's nuanced,
Yep.
and to take an extra second, and to ask an extra question, and to take a step back, and to really engage with that nuanced reality.
Yeah. Beautiful. And I think, one of the great things that might come from your book, and I'm sure it will to small degree and hopefully to larger and larger degree, is encouraging people to interact in a stewardship relationship with the land that they live on right now. So many people feel unempowered, disempowered, or like they don't have the skill set or the knowledge necessary. Oh, I'm not a forester, that sort of thinking. But really, it's just this endlessly nuanced relationship that you have with your land, and you do it just like pruning an apple tree. You do something,
Mm,
and then a couple years later, you're like, oh, if I did it again, I would do it this way, And it's this evolution of skills, knowledge, and seeing how ecosystems and indeed individual plants respond. So that,
mm.
to me, that's what I think your book will sort of continue to ripple out, is encouraging folks to just be participants in the land and
Yeah,
recognize it's going to be hard sometimes. You are going to
yeah,
have to take something out that you love.
and that's ultimately, like, more than any individual. It's not a cookbook. Like, more than any individual technique that that I do on my land. What I really want people to carry with them to wherever they are, and whoever they are, and whatever situation that they're in, is just that, that idea, that energy, and this concept of nuance, and this concept of stewardship, right? I don't need everybody to do exactly the same thing that I do.
Right.
Ultimately, what I want is to speak to our relationship to these ecosystems, and to empower people with the tools, hopefully, that they need to build a better world, which we can, and we just gotta do it.
Yes, perfect. Well, Ethan, I really appreciate your time and introducing us to your book. And hopefully, everybody listening will go out and buy it and feel inspired to do the stewardship thing even more so, or at a different
Mm,
level. Again, that's what I love about the permaculture world, is so many people are actively engaged in their own landscape. We take that like theory and knowledge, and we try to get our dirt time and to learn how these systems work. And most of us, myself definitely included, were not raised that way. I was not raised as a
mhm.
landscape manager. So it's really like, okay, that's what I'm going to spend my life doing, is figuring out how to manage my little piece of the earth here and try to do it in a regenerative way, supporting ecosystems as we go. So this has been a wonderful conversation. I want to shout out everybody in the chat. It's been a really lively chat. I appreciate you guys
Mm.
sharing resources and stories. They've been great. I haven't shared them all, but I've read them all. And Ethan, I'll give the last word to you. Where might you send folks? Do you want to put anybody onto like social media channels? And then what
Yeah.
might you say just by a last word to our audience?
Yeah, so you can check out my work. You can, number one, order How to Love a Forest anywhere books are sold, and it's a hardcover and it's an ebook, and it's an audiobook. And I would say that if you have the choice, order it from your local independent bookseller,
Definitely.
and ask your local library to get it. We just and then if you love it, post a 5-star review on Amazon or Goodreads, and that'll be really the most important part of spreading this message. And I'm on social media. Pretty largest following is on Instagram, and I also have a Patreon for folks who want to support me in that way. And you get my monthly column, and you can get Bear Island maple syrup from my land here, which turned out it could have a little sugar bush, and signed books and things like that. But yeah, follow me on Instagram, order the book, or on TikTok, YouTube, Facebook. Order the book, review it if you love it, and yeah, go out there and be humble and be brave and heal those forests.
Amen, my friend. Thank you so much again for your time, and thanks everybody for being here. We'll see you on the next one.